This is why so-called progressives will not let Rona end. Here is what confuses me about San Francisco. This is a Twitter thread from a woman named Michelle Tandler. Now, I had never heard of this woman until a couple days ago, but apparently she is a San Francisco native and moderate liberal. Now, I too am from the San Francisco Bay Area, right? I grew up in Oakland and went to college in San Francisco. I later moved to Brooklyn, New York, and my family's from Michigan. That's how I explain the Detroit hat. Also, you can never go wrong with Old English, but this Twitter thread is actually brilliant, and it lets me know that Rona will never end. Of course, I think we all knew that Rona will never end, but if it did, these so-called progressives would have a lot of questions to answer. So she says, we have the most liberal left-wing government and population in the country. We have a $13 billion budget, and we have 8,000 people sleeping in the rain this week. Can someone please explain this to me? What do progressives stand for exactly? I thought it was about making things more fair, about standing up for the little guy, about human rights, equality, equity, compassion. San Francisco, to me, looks like the least compassionate city on the planet. And that's true. For a long time, I used to say they had pseudo-tolerance, right? So they paint this picture, they project this image of everybody being welcomed, but you get there on the ground and you realize quickly that that is not true. You can ask anybody who's ever worn a red hat in San Francisco. She continues, the slums of Mumbai look cleaner than the streets of downtown San Francisco. This isn't just the Tenderloin, it's Soma, parts of the Mission, Dogpatch. We have thousands of people wandering around looking like they are on the brink of death. This is why people use the term zombie. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, the Tenderloin is notoriously one of the worst neighborhoods, probably in the whole country, but definitely in San Francisco, and Mayor London Breed recently declared a state of emergency in that neighborhood alone because that's where most of the drug trade and overdoses are happening. And the district attorney was not too happy about that. I made a video about him a couple days ago. Go ahead and check that out. And if you have time, look into Mohammed Nuru. He is the former Department of Public Works head in San Francisco who London Breed, the mayor, used to date and was taking gifts from. It was a complete mess, and it's also a different story, but it does play a little bit of a part in how San Francisco got so awful. She goes on, I've been a registered Democrat for 18 years. I grew up in a progressive family and went to a progressive school and have mostly progressive friends. Yet what I see in San Francisco, if this is what progressive stands for, I want the opposite. Well, that too makes sense, right? I think a lot of people for a long time have called progressives regressives. We're also seeing these weird segregation things pop up across the country with separate graduations and separate dorm rooms and separate park nights. So that's par for the course. That's exactly what these people are after is regression, but it's cloaked in this term progressive, right? The words used here, harm reduction, housing first, criminal justice, social justice, equity, they don't align with what I'm seeing at all. Our strategy might as well be called harm increased, housing last, victim justice, social injustice, unfairness. Yesterday, I went for a drive in the rain. This is what is happening in San Francisco right now, and she posts a couple of awful photos. Now, again, I've been seeing this for years, and I guess it's good that this is finally getting the attention it deserves, and it has gotten worse. I don't think it was always quite like this. It's definitely gotten worse, but it was never amazing, at least not in my lifetime. I never experienced the amazing, beautiful San Francisco. Where is our $13 billion going exactly? How do we only have 3,000 shelter beds when 8,000 are unsheltered in the streets? How is this an American city? That's a great question. It definitely looks like a third world slum, but that's what happens when you have this one-party rule of corrupt politicians from Nancy Pelosi and Gavin Newsom and Chesa Boudin, London Breed, Libby Schaaf. All of these people have completely, bled California as a whole completely dry. And then she says, I'm starting to develop a seriously dark view of the progressive politicians in charge of our town. They have absolute power, act like a regime, and talk often of how broken the system is. Are the homeless their foot soldiers, mascots, mercenaries? You have to wonder, with the funds we have as a city, state, and nation, is this situation on purpose? Very good question. It seems like it can only be this bad by design. We saw what San Francisco was capable of when the pandemic hit. We had testing sites up in days, hotels converted into shelter, funds flowing, yet here we are. Is this nefarious? Absolutely. I don't think anybody thinking clearly can say that this is by accident or that this is good for the city or anybody in the city. These, bums or junkies or whatever's going on there, these policies just don't work. And we're also seeing in New York the brand new safe injection sites. But in San Francisco, your safe injection site is basically everywhere. Nobody cares, all right? And I'll be honest, I haven't been there in a couple years, but I assume that it hasn't gotten any better since I left. Same with New York City. And this is the last one I want to read before we get to another story in the Washington Examiner. Progressives tend to blame Republicans for almost everything, yet here we are, not a Republican in sight, and I think we may be the most deranged city on the planet. Nowhere is there such inequality. I've never seen destruction at this scale. And she links to an article, UN report calls Bay Area homeless crisis human rights violation. Special report cites San Francisco and Oakland, along with worst slums in the world. So this amazing thread calls out the progressive quote leadership or quote progressive quote leadership in San Francisco. But it gets worse, because if you hop over here to this story from the Washington Examiner, homeless and clueless in Oakland and elsewhere in America. This is a story written by the former mayor of Oakland, Elihu Harris. He was mayor back in the 90s. And he says that Oakland, California has always lived in the shadow of San Francisco. Now, in one metric at least, it surpasses the city across the bay. Homelessness. So we just heard that terrible thread of how awful San Francisco is. And then we get an article from the former mayor of Oakland saying that Oakland is now actually worse than San Francisco.